Fulfilling your deepest longings. That's the title of today's sharing. And the first thing that I'd like to share is ancient myths, legends, and modern fantasy stories reveal humanity's longings. And I'll unpack that a little later, all right? The second thing is the Christian story answers humanity's deepest longings. And they are found in the most popular stories that keep appearing in our movies and books. And then the third thing is philosophy that proposes life without God will turn us into beings without any moral reference, and hellish, but it does not address our deepest longings. And final, Jesus, through his life, death, and resurrection, shows us that it is possible to achieve our deepest longings in and through him. Now, I don't know about you. You've got your deepest longings. For some of you, you long for coffee, right? You long for a good cup of coffee. And you know what a good cup of coffee tastes like. I know it's a pandemic and most of our coffee shops are closed, right? But you can have takeaway. You have your coffee and you drink your coffee. And then you say, oh, you know what? This coffee doesn't taste like the one I've tasted, and that's really the best. This is not the best, all right? And you long for good coffee. Likewise for food, you taste food and you say, oh my, this is not the best. I've tasted better. So in all of us, that is ingrained in us, our standard, it's in our DNA. We long for something that is better. Right? How about our deeper longings? How can we find what our deeper longings are? Some of you are parents and grandparents. Your deeper longing is to see and hug your children and grandkids. Or some of you, your deeper longing could be to see your parents and grandparents and to touch and feel them and to tell them that you love them. Now, I don't know about Singapore, but in Canada, we've had a pretty bad, situation with our seniors' home. Many of our seniors have died in our seniors' home because the coronavirus had hit them and hit them really hard, to the point where children have been forbidden from visiting their parents. Grandkids couldn't see their grandparents and they were dying, and in some cases they couldn't even call them. Things had broken down in the seniors facility. So for them, their deepest longing would be to touch and feel them, to love them, to say I love you, or to feel being loved. For some of you, the last thing you want is to be near your parents or grandparents or even children, because they may bring painful memories, and no one longs for that. Where can we go to find what our deepest longings are? To do that, you need to go to stories. You go to find what your deepest longings are. Now, it was J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, some of you will remember who J.R.R. Tolkien is, right? He was a professor of English language and literature at Oxford. He wrote a famous essay on fairy story in which he tells that if you want to get to the heart of what we really ultimately long for as human beings, you will find it not in realistic fiction, but in fantasy fiction. And what do I mean by that? Our deepest longings can be found in high fantasy, where we can experience good overcome evil, death defeated by immortality, and we can communicate with non-human beings. We can have deep friendships and experience love that is eternal, not having to part forever. And so Tolkien says, look, it is in these stories that we find what we as human beings are really looking for. Why do we spend millions of dollars worldwide to go and see fairy tales again and again? Walt Disney is making its classic animated movies in live action form, right? Some of you would have seen Jungle Book. Universal Studios, they came with Snow White and the Huntsman. And I understand now Disney is coming up with a live version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, where evil is overcome by good, and the princess finds her true love and marries and lives with him forever. In Toy Story, we see this again, taking place in a world where anthropomorphic toys come to life. When humans are not present, the plot focuses on the relationship between an old-fashioned pull-string cowboy doll named Woody and an astronaut action figure, Buzz Lightyear, as they evolve from rivals competing for the affection of their owner, Andy Davis, to become friends who work together to be reunited with him after being separated from him. You know, it was the highest grossing film during its opening weekend, eventually earning over $373 million at the worldwide box office. It was acclaimed by critics and audiences, and so with Toy Story 2, 3, and 4. And you remember that song, You've Got a Friend in Me. It is considered by many to be one of the best animated films ever made. And you remember that catchphrase, that stock phrase from Buzz Lightyear? What was it? To infinity and beyond. Why? Because embedded in us is a deep longing for immortality. It is built into our DNA. Isn't it strange that in a world where we seem to worship reason, logic, and have elevated science to a stage of deity, that we should be going back again and again to something that seems to be just the opposite? All these ideas of witches and dragons and making up things that have never existed. Well, Tolkien would say there's a profound reason why we do this. Because deep in our hearts, we have deep longings for things that only story, especially fantasy story, can draw out. And Tolkien was a professor of literature, and he wrote The Lord of the Rings. Now, some of you might say, oh, that is well and good in movies and all that sort of thing, you know, but in real life, we need something solid and real to live by, not fantasy. To answer that question, I want to take you to Dostoevsky. If you Googled and wanted to find out who are some of the foremost writers of Western classics, you will come across Dostoevsky. His two books, Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, are listed as the top 20 books in Western classics. In Brothers Karamazov, his final and finest writing, Dostoevsky sets his story in the family of the Karamazovs. It is a time when the West, Europe in particular, was going through a great social, philosophical, and religious convulsion. People were seeing the death of the great Christian idea, the Christian culture. What Dostoevsky does in his novel is to show what happens when you remove God from any relevant place in your story. His smartest character is Ivan Karamazov, a young intellectual familiar with the intellectual philosophical movements in Europe. Ivan says that once you've removed God, you also remove all ideas of morality. Because God is the standard for good and bad. When you remove him, you remove all ideas of good and bad. And that is a state known as nihilism. If you were to check the curriculum at the philosophy department at NUS, you will find only 3 philosophers are given significance. For those of you who are not from Singapore, NUS is the National University of Singapore, considered one of the top 25 universities in the world when I last checked. In their philosophy department, only 3 philosophers are given significance, at least for undergraduates. 2, Hume and Kant, you do in one course, but Nietzsche takes a whole course to digest. What Dostoevsky says here, Nietzsche takes it and develops it, and he is the father of modern philosophy. Now, some of you might think, what is all this philosophy stuff? Like, what has that got to do with people like me? I'm just an ordinary guy. Come on, you know, like all this philosophy and all that. Just remember this, okay? Philosophy is a way of looking at life. Every one of you has a philosophy. We all do. It drives us. It makes us, it causes us to make decisions, and we live by our philosophy. All right. So philosophy is just a way of looking at life. Philosophers are able to articulate it in very powerful ways, and it influences society in a massive way. And Nietzsche comes just after Dostoevsky. And I want you to stay with me for a while because it has profoundly affected not just the West, but also the East. So you think, oh, this is just all in, America and Europe and all that stuff. It's not for us in Singapore and India and all that. Not so. It is affecting everyone, everywhere. All right. Now, so stay with me, and I'm going to take and show you what Nietzsche did. All right. So Friedrich Nietzsche, what he did was this. He gave a fresh story for the West and the world. A fresh story. All right. Now that we have killed God, okay. When he said we have killed God, what he's saying is, look, our philosophers have unpacked philosophy to such an extent that we have now found there is no need for God. Now that we have removed God from existence, what will our future be without God? So Nietzsche gave the world a new basis for a new story to be erected on the foundations of a collapsed Christian story. It wasn't just Nietzsche also. Karl Marx did that too, and was the founder of communism. But I'm not going to go into that too much. And Nietzsche was a devastating critic of institutional Christianity and became the father of modern philosophy. If you were to go to university to be a teacher, you'll be asked to become familiar with Nietzsche's disciples like Derrida and Foucault. Our school system, our politics, and our culture is thoroughly infused with the philosophy of people like Nietzsche and his disciples. So Nietzsche was a complex thinker. Now that he saw that the West had killed God, he says this, don't jump for joy, because now that you have killed him, you cannot talk of the future in terms of good and bad anymore. He prophesies that with the death of God, there will come terrible disaster. So both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were prophets, because after them came the Second World War, the First World War and the Second World War. Okay. Whilst Dostoevsky landed on the side of God, that means Dostoevsky says, look, you cannot do that. If you remove God, you're done with what it means to be human and what it means to have a meaningful society. But Nietzsche says, no, I am going to give you the new perspective about the future without God. All right? And this is what he did. He says, I am going to suggest to you the Übermensch, which in German means the above person, the above man. He's not a good man or a bad man. No. Because when you talk about good and bad, these categories are Christian. Since Western philosophers had reasoned God out of existence, they cannot go back to Christian thinking. Nietzsche then proposes a new way of thinking of the future for humanity, where the values are beyond good and evil. You're now free to become whatever you want to be. And guess who was enamored by Nietzsche's philosophy? Now, there it is. Nietzsche says that we should reject Christian morality, humility, pity, meekness, modern democracy, compromise and commonality, traditional values and cultures, because he felt that they were producing a decadent culture. We must find our Übermensch, the future, all right? A solution to freedom from everything. And Nietzsche thinks that we shouldn't be content with the state of mediocrity, but instead strive for perfection. And Hitler turned Nietzsche's Übermensch into the superior Aryan Germanic race. He found in Nietzsche's idea, he twisted it, and that story, now I know that the Second World War and the Nazi movement was fueled also by social, political, and economic reasons. But there's also an underlying deep philosophical reason, and Hitler capitalized on Nietzsche's thinking, and it fueled even the intellectuals in Germany, all right? So, friends, philosophy has a powerful impact because philosophy is a story. It's a story about who we are and where we are headed. And it tries to unpack what our deepest longings can be. All right. So now when I say we, it's not just the West, it's also the East. We're now at a stage where we are questioning, even if biology alone should determine how we feel about our sexuality. We have no problems changing our definition about when a person becomes a human, and we can eliminate millions of unborn children in the name of freedom. Friends, stories do form you. There was an experiment with two groups of university students doing multiple choice exam. One group were given questions with the word old, O-L-D, repeatedly appearing in the questionnaire. The other group had the word young. Then they observed how the students, after the exam was over, walked to the elevator. You know what? Those who were exposed with the word old walked slowly. Those who were exposed with the word young walked a little faster. The stories that you believe in have a profound impact on how you live. You go to the wrong story, it can turn you even to a monster. Now, what is one of the most dominant story of our time today? That we are a product of accident over millions of years of natural selection by mindless matter. This is the Darwinian view, Charles Darwinian view, that we have evolved with no intelligent designer beyond our evolution. And it is having a profound effect on our society. We now have come up with a story that describes our beginnings and our present and points to an uncertain future at the hands of nature. This story is held so rigidly that anyone thinking otherwise is considered a stupid moron out of touch with reality. There is no place now for mystery or wonder. They can explain everything. And I want to introduce you to someone who had a profound impact on Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, a man by the name of G.K. Chesterton. What Chesterton says is something like this: look, if you can reason everything out, if you can explain everything in the universe and understand everything in the universe, you would have reduced that universe into a small place. Your universe will become a small world. There's no place for mystery anymore. There's no place for surprises anymore. And he says that's how the word lunatic comes. Lunatic comes from the word luna, which is the moon. It's a small circle. You have reduced your world, and there's no place for mystery anymore. And that is one of the reasons why we keep going back to fantasy and fiction, fantasy fiction, because why? There's mystery, there's wonder, there's immortality, there is life after death, there is love eternal. Well, friends, what story you believe in is crucial to your future, to our future. The greatest story ever told and written over thousands of years is that found in the Bible. Thousands of years. It's a story, a profound story. It is a story that reveals the depths of our evil and the heights of our virtues. And behind it all, it reveals our deepest longings for evil to be finally overcome by good, for justice to be permanent and fair for all, for death to be finally defeated by immortality, for friendships that will last forever, and for love that never ends. And for someone who will represent all that in one individual. You're looking for that person. Who will that be? The Bible says that person is Christ. He died the death that we should have died. His disciples and everyone saw it happen. There were many eyewitnesses. Then the impossible happened. He rose again from the dead. He attained something no other human being has ever experienced in recorded history. Friends, I want to say this. This story is life-giving. Can you see that? There is hope. In the Darwinian version, when you die, that's it. You're done. Nature blindly chooses and has chosen you. But in the biblical story, there is a reason for your existence. That you're loved. That you're wanted by God himself, and he longs for you. I want to read a story, and we're going to end with that, all right? And that is Jesus walking with his disciples. Jesus had already risen from the dead, and he is walking beside two men, and they don't know that Jesus is walking with them. They thought that Jesus was just somebody in Jerusalem. So that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, so Jesus asked them, hey, what are you discussing together as you walk along? And they stood still, their faces downcast, because they didn't know that Jesus had risen from the dead. One of them, Cleopas, asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that are happening these days? Like, come on, like, where do you come from? And look at Jesus' answer. He's so funny. Look at his humor. What things, guys? What things? What are you talking about? What things? What about Jesus of Nazareth? They replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. And then they go on to tell everything that he did. And then he said to them, Jesus said to them, how foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things? Didn't you see? Could you see the story? Could you see the story as leading to who Jesus is and what he did? And so, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explains to them what was said and what the story is about. That the story is about him. Verse 28, and as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going further. You notice that? He did not want to go further. He wanted to talk to them, but as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, please stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over. So, okay, I'll stay with you, he says, When he was at the table, they were eating. Verse 31, their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Then they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and showed us that what the story is, the big story is, and that he is the end of that story? He is the true Übermensch, the above, the beyond person, the person that Nietzsche wants humanity to become. This is the person. It is Jesus. And he proved it through his resurrection in real history. Friends, takeaway lesson: ancient myths, legends, and modern fantasy stories reveal humanity's deepest longing. So every time you watch a fantasy fiction, or even any fiction, or any movie for that matter, look for the underlying story, the longing there. The Christian story answers humanity's deepest longings that are found in all the most popular stories and even movies and books. But the philosophy that proposes life without God will turn us into beings without any moral reference, and hellish, for it does not address our deepest longings. Jesus, through his life, death, and resurrection, shows that it is possible to achieve our deepest longings in and through him. And a quick takeaway lesson, practical application for some of us. Look at how Jesus answered. He asked questions even when he knew the answer. You notice that? Some of us, we want to talk a lot, we just talk a lot. And I know I do that myself too, and I catch myself and say, no, ask questions. And Jesus often asks, there's so much to ask people and find out, what are they thinking? Where are they? People are not dumb. They have a lot of stuff to talk about. Ask questions. Second, inject humor. Hey, inject humor. There's humor in Jesus, And thirdly, keep the conversation going. Keep the conversation going. Jesus kept the conversation going. And then finally, you see, you need to read the great story. And the great story is found in the Bible. Look, the last 50 years, the best-selling book every year has been the Bible. It's such. You look at the New York Times book review at the bestsellers, they'll never talk about the Bible being the bestseller because it's just everyone knows about it. Right? 5 billion books, 5 billion Bibles. Okay, this is just printed versions. Okay, the next most published book was Mao Zedong's Quotations, 400 million, and the third one was Rowlandson's Harry Potter, 300 million. Friends, 100 years from now, people would have forgotten Harry Potter. People would have forgotten Mao Zedong's quotes. But they'll never forget the true longings in our hearts are finally fulfilled in someone who really, truly loved you and died for you and rose again from the dead. Our true longing. I'll stop there. I'm going to pass now to Leslie and Cecilia.